Sometimes you need to take control to make a difference. That's why with FlexPath from Capella University, you're in control. Set your own deadlines and leverage your experience to move at a pace that works for you. Discover a different way forward at capella.edu.
Something is creeping in, don't follow it down.
24 hours ago, I found out the person that I've been dating for the last 6 months is a con man.
That is my sister Emma. Andrew Tonks's lies had been so convincing, she'd invested $300,000 with him. However, the tables were about to turn on Andrew. What he didn't know was that Emma had discovered his real identity. But to get any chance of justice, Emma had to act like it was business as usual. Coming up in this series.
And that's when murder, all this stuff goes through my mind. I'm really, really scared.
I'm assuming Sarah has watched too much Netflix and figures I've been defrauding you. Couldn't be further from the truth.
That's what this was, a real-life story that seems so unbelievable, but it was actually true.
A true story that all starts with one simple swipe to the right. I'm Sarah Ferris.
And I'm Emma Ferris, and this is my story, Conning the Con.
There was a lot of things like that where you'd think, what the
From Stuff, a new 12-part documentary podcast.
He was into sex every day.
The Commune. Sex, drugs, and a guru called Bert. There are crimes, but this isn't a whodunit, it's a whydunit.
Good God, adults agreed to this?
The Commune. Find it now on your favourite podcast platform or at stuff.co.nz/thecommune.
You've already been welcomed to Centre Point.
Hello listeners and welcome to this week's episode of The Cult Vault. I'm your speaker Casey and today's conversation takes place with Kristen Decker, survivor of forced polygamy, author and founder of the Sound Choices Coalition, a non-profit helping people escape polygamy. Joining us in this conversation is the director of the Sound Choices Coalition and international human rights lawyer Jane Ridley. Since this conversation took place, I have arranged to speak with Kristen about her writing and her experiences in more depth. Also, the Sound Choices Coalition have recently renamed to My Sound Choices, where they will focus on helping individuals escape all destructive religious practices. Today, I will be doing a 12-hour live stream with an aim to raise money for this non-profit, as well as raise money and awareness for this podcast. Check out the links in the episode description to find out how you can support today, and please consider joining me for the live stream, 12 till 12 Eastern Time. Now here are Kristen and Jane. So hello, Kristen and Jane, and thank you for agreeing to come and chat on the show today. We are going to be discussing your organisation, the Sound Choices Coalition today, which aims to help survivors of a certain demographic, which I am looking forward to exploring in this conversation. So would you like to introduce yourselves to the listeners? Kristen.
Hey there. It's good to meet up with you, Casey. I'm Kristen Decker, and I was born and raised in polygamy and escaped and happy ever after.
And Jane?
I'm Jane, and I actually first met Kristen when I was doing my master's thesis. So my master's is in international human rights law, and I did my thesis concerning freedom of religion and sort of, in particular, the human rights abuses within religious cults and how the US legal system fails to protect victims of abuse. That's how Kristen and I kind of met, and we both have the same goal, but we come at it from totally different angles.
I think a lot of that came through in the notes and some of the correspondence that you sent over to me as well. So I'm looking forward to unpacking a little bit of the different angles that you both bring to the work that you do. And to Kristen, can you just explain to the listeners what the Sound Choices Coalition is as we go into really talking about what this organisation offers?
You bet. When I left, it was a long process. I'm going to say I started leaving at about 38, questioning everything I'd been born and raised into, the cult I'd been born into, which was fundamentalist polygamy. And my dad was a prophet for 28 of those years. But when I left, I realized, I wrote a book, and I realized that there were people coming and speaking out to me from all angles. And I thought my story was crazy, but the others were more insane. And there's no end to the horrors and atrocities. And I thought someone needs to do something about this. We need to speak out. We need to help victims. There's got to be some changes made. So it took me a while. I tried to sign up with a whole bunch of other things that were already happening, and it didn't seem to be fitting the goal of helping. In fact, there were things out there that were just helping people stay. And we could get into more of that if you wanted to. But basically, I thought, no, we really need to address the harms of polygamy and advocate for its victims. So that's what we're about. Since 2013, we've got a 501c3, and we speak to the harms of polygamy and advocate for its victims. And we do that in many different angles and ways over the years. So it was really awesome to meet Jane. Yeah.
So you recognized that there was a need for something during your deconstruction or divorce from religion, and the things that you were finding in terms of resources and support were not entirely helping through your whole journey. You needed kind of something to address the abuses that come with polygamy, not just the religious side of things, the deconstruction. Would you say that's kind of a fair way to look at it?
That's really close. What we were realizing is that we do have freedom of religion, and that's huge in Utah. That's where I was born and raised. That's something to address, but because of Utah, and we call this coercive polygamy, not just like polyamory and things like that, but because I was born and raised and believed I had to live this way. And then you go along, and thousands of hundreds of other men and women who've gone along with that. And yes, what the needs for helping people were more or less just helping them figure out how to stay, how to break the laws, how to get away with this, how to get on welfare and food stamps, which, is huge for these huge families. So definitely when people needed to leave, we needed to look at legal parts of that. And what are the needs? What are the housing? What is going to be when it comes to education systems and things that we never learned and never got? And I don't mean to say we, meaning everyone, but the majority. So.
And Jane, you're relatively new to the organization, and you're not actually based in Utah yourself. So how was it that you became involved in the Sound Choices Coalition?
I mean, mostly through my dissertation, and because of part of my dissertation, I was actually interviewing survivors of cults, and I ended up narrowing it down to Scientology and then polygamy, because they're the same but different. Obviously, all cults have some sort of similarities, but those two in particular, and the amount of participants I got kind of helped that. But when I interviewed Kristen from a different perspective, she was a survivor, but she was also the director or the founder of Sound Choices. I then tapped into this whole other sort of realm of, wait, there are things out there trying to help people, but there might be obstacles in the way, or just like, how can we, sort of help a bit better? And we kept in touch outside of my studies via Facebook and that. And then Kristen invited me to join Sound Choices, which I gladly accepted. And we've been working together ever since for about just over a year now. Because I think we've got like a lot of energy and a lot of ideas, and we're just sort of trying to rebuild, because there were some changes in the Utah legislation. So we're trying to rebuild and see how we can help people working within the new remit, I guess, of Utah.
Kristen, you said that you left the polygamous organization or religious movement that your father was a leader of, and then you wrote a book. Did the book come first, or did SCC come first? And what are the dates? Because I think it was 2013 that the SCC was founded by yourself. So I'm just kind of wondering what your journey looked like before meeting Jane in 2020.
So I believe the book came first because my push to do the coalition was when I kept hearing so many heartaches and sad stories and abuses, and from the AUB group that I was born and raised in, but other fundamentalist, LDS fundamentalist polygamous groups. And the stories were so sad and so heartbreaking. And so I gathered up a couple women who'd left the same group that I had left, and we decided we wanted to speak about it and write about it and try to make a difference for other people. And in all these years of doing this, it's been, like I said, tough to do in Utah. Polygamy pretty much originated here. Didn't really, but it's kept going here. And it's part of the whole system. And so it's been really tough to address all the needs and the issues and get people to really look into this. But the more I spoke about my book, the more I traveled and had speaking engagements, the more stories I heard. And I thought, yes, somebody has to do something different. We brought up the coalition and what it looked like, and it's several times on how, where, and what. Originally, we were hands-on, helping people literally escape who wanted to. And we were finding a lot of legal issues with that, especially if it was underage people. But we have been very involved in mentoring and helping people move from transition places and find out where they can get education, resources, and those sorts of things. And so it's been something that's been a passion to me forever and always, is to try to help make a difference. We get accused a lot of times of, or I should say I do, of being anti-polygamist. And there's a big difference, because these are my family and relatives and friends and loved ones for the most part. And even sometimes their philosophy makes me frustrated and angry, I love them as good. Most of them are good people. And it's just that I want them to realize that polygamy is the harm and the danger there, and how subjective that is for those of us who were born and raised in it and believe we have to do it or we're going to go to hell. So yes, it was wonderful for me to leave and to try to make a difference and to continue this.
It just sounds like such incredible work, especially when we speak to people on the podcast, or even when people say, you know, on Reddit and other forums and public spaces where cults and coercive groups are being discussed, there are people that always say, you know, why don't you just leave? And of course, it's not as easy as that, because as you've mentioned, there may be no access to any finances to help you. In a place like Utah, where the community groups involved with one another are so insular and set themselves aside from the secular world and anything outside of that culture and community, it'd be hard for a person who's been homeschooled, who's been, you know, second, third generation members to even know how far they'd have to walk to get outside of the influences of that community, let alone, you know, as you mentioned, further education or some type of public education that would be accredited in a way that would be recognized by employers and all of those things. And that's often a conversation that comes up on this show. But it's my understanding, Jane, that even though your values do align with Kristyn's, you come at this work from a very different angle. And I'm just wondering if you could shed some light on that for the listeners.
Yeah, so basically my background is policing, and then I moved into human rights law. So to address the sort of question of why don't people just leave, it's exactly the same as why people can't leave a domestic abusive relationship. And in the UK, we're really lucky. I'm not sure whether you're aware of this, but in 2015, a law came into existence, I suppose, that covers control and coercive behaviour. Which, if we could transplant that law into like Utah, you would have more grounds to sort of stand on and to move forward. Because we talk about coerced polygamy, and it's not a choice. There's lots of consensual polyamory relationships, and we're not hating on them at all. That's totally, utterly, complete different thing. So we come at it from different angles, because I'm coming at it from like a legal brain. I'm coming at it from first-hand experience in terms of policing. Obviously, I didn't police cults, but I policed domestic abuse and one thing another. So I've had a lot of training, and then my passion for human rights grew. So I abandoned that and got my master's at the University of York. So me and Kristen kind of work really well together, because she'll come at me from an emotional standpoint that's 100% valid. And I will come in and go, okay, I can hear you, but we can't go at it from that angle. You can't do like class action against a cult, because it doesn't fit the remit of class action. So we're looking at it from a different angle, and we're trying to dissect it into a way where we could hold people accountable, or we can help people in other ways. There's so many like psychologists out there helping with trauma, and that's fantastic. We need them so much, but we also need to stop the cycle of abuse. And if we can tap in and break that cycle, we might have a chance of, I wouldn't say we'd end it in our lifetime because it's so ingrained into society in Utah, but we can certainly make headway, a bit like Scientology are with the Danny Masterson case. I'm not sure whether you're aware of that. But again, it's another legal route, and it's taken them forever to get him into court. So if we can start understanding the abuse and then putting it into a legal framework and then seeing where we can go in Utah or out of state, that's where we'll be able to make a lot of headway. So yeah, we come at it from totally different angles, but we both have the same goal and we're both very passionate about it. It's hard listening to survivors, but it's also extraordinary to work with them and go, you're alive, you've made this, you know, you are successful because you're here speaking to me right now. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of understanding of how to help them navigate the world coming out of this. The same with somebody in a domestic abusive relationship when they've been controlled for so long. They don't have bank accounts. Cult people don't have bank accounts. So we're going to go help them, you know.
The work that you're both doing, then coming at it from those two angles, it gives the work itself and, you know, the ethos of the work an extra layer, in the sense that, you know, Kristen can look at the stuff that survivors might need now in terms of, you know, emotional support and directing them to safe places where they can get that. And then Jane, you're kind of thinking about the long game. Where does it end? What changes do we want to see, and how can we make those changes? And of course, every single person that tells their story and comes forward adds to the potential that there can be class action lawsuits. So of course, yeah, absolutely extraordinary. The strength of people that come forward to talk is amazing.
So what I feel is that this morning I was talking with Jane about our situations that are just heart-rending and heartbreaking. And yes, Jane was absolutely right. I'm working close at home with people that I'm pretty much related to and see and know personally, and their kids and their kids and their kids. And I'm a sixth generation, you know, in not now, but fundamentalist polygamist, what lived polygamy, got out. And the harms of polygamy and the abuses and the sadness and the heartaches everywhere around. And for me, it's a gift to have somebody who knows these legal. I feel like we have our personal lawyer. I don't mean to put Jane on a pedestal in that way, but she keeps saying, no, it doesn't work this way. And now we have to do this. And wait a minute, back up here. And, you know, it's been incredible to have somebody who can help counsel and advise us in ways that hopefully we can progress and move forward and make a difference legally, as well as not just with all this other stuff, but how can we really get into the victims' hearts and help them realize there's a new way and a better way, and that they don't have to do that. I wish so many times I was the Pied Piper and could just, you know, lead everybody out and just say there's so much joy and freedom out here. And I'm getting off the subject. I apologize. I do that. But yeah, Jane is going to be really, has been, and is going to continue to be a really asset to the coalition. And I'm grateful for everyone else who's coming on board and who has done work with us. We just couldn't do it without people, and they help.
And there's been a few mentions of polyamory, coerced and consensual polygamy. So I wondered if this would be a good time to maybe explore for myself and the listeners what the difference is in all of these terms that we may be using, and how people can actually educate themselves better to understand different relationships and dynamics, and actually how there might be multiple people in a relationship and that might be safe. It's not necessarily going to be abusive, but what are the signs of some cases where there may be polyamory or polygamy and it is abusive and unsafe? I don't know which one of you would rather answer that question, maybe both.
I could answer it from the lay part, and then Jane can talk about more of the legal part and what that looks like too. But and for me, in being a plural wife and polygamy all around me and having it be coercive, my belief was that I had to do this. We all did, that we were going to have to do this. We had to get along with each other. We had to provide tons of children for our husbands. It was a religious requirement to get to heaven. And if we didn't allow and encourage our husbands to have plural wives, then we were defective and could be destroyed, as was directed by the person. The fundamentalist polygamists believe what Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon Church, started in the Doctrine and Covenants 132. He actually says that if a woman doesn't allow their husband and to have plural wives, that she will be destroyed. You can read that. Anybody could read that. But that's where we got the belief system. That's what I grew up with, what my parents did, their parents, and on and on and on for 6 generations. So we believe we had to do this. And it's heartbreaking. And nobody that I know of really wants to be forced to share their husband sexually and have children that, I mean, I bore 7 children and I loved them and I don't regret any of them, but I don't know that had I not believed I had to populate the world, that I would have really chosen a genuine choice, which is sound choices, to have had that many children. I don't feel like I did a good justice to them. And these huge families, humongous families, as you see on the TLC show that's so famous, is it's crazy making. It's insane. And sadness and the jealousy and the heartache never ends. And the children don't get the love and attention that they need and deserve. And so that's, to me, the complete living side of fundamentalist plural marriage. And I can see, I'm totally pro-choice if an adult decides to have polyamorous relationships and what that might look like. Oh, one more thing real quick is that if we were jealous or sad or mad or show any feelings at all, then we were considered defective. We are being horrible or wicked or need to pray, or we need to read the scriptures, and we need to be better and we need to be stronger. And our husbands can always run away. If I complain, he could run to the next wife. If she complains, he can run away or run to me. There's no accountability for them to deal with emotions, and some men will. I'm not saying they're all like that. Some men have been incredibly good because they're good men and believe in trying to do the best they can. But I have to say real fast too about that is I have found and discovered after talking to my brother years ago and other men that it can be terrifying and heartbreaking for them too. My brother felt like a constant failure trying to keep 3 wives happy and be equal and love them equally and raise them and have a bunch of kids and try to be the father and be there for them all. And he was depressed and angry and suicidal too. So that is the inside perspective of coercive fundamentalist polygamy. And Jane can address the other part of it really well. Yeah.
So I think Kristen's really explained it quite well. But the sort of, I suppose the difference is with polyamory, it's totally consensual. It's between adults. Love is love. There's lots of freedom. It's also legal because they're not committing bigamy. It is just love is love and they're sharing the love and they have understandings and it's all sort of airy is the only way I can think. It's light, it's airy and it feels good. Whereas with polygamy, it's indoctrinated, especially people born into it. And it's almost like in the outside world, you would consider it to be grooming, which obviously is an offence because you're cherry picking children from a young age to marry usually someone that's related to them, like their uncle. And they're so at a young age, this uncle who's considerably older is looking at this child, watching them grow up. And it's oh, that's going to be my wife. And often they have underage marriage. And when we take that out into the real world, that's grooming, that's sexual assault, that's rape against a child. There's all of these offences, but in their coercive behaviour, they think it's normal. And as a child, you're oh, this is normal because that's all you know. But when you get older Kristen and I discussed this, and in terms of like difference between sort of sex and then non-consensual sex is your body is meant to enjoy sex. It's meant to have all the good feels and everything else. And when those feelings go and your body starts to dry up and freeze and your muscles and everything, and you're like, wait, this doesn't feel good. This isn't good for me. My body's telling me no. My body's rejecting this as a movement. Like, these people don't know that that's the way your body's telling you that that's wrong. And they don't have sort of their own, not that they don't have their own mind, but I suppose to an extent they don't have their own mind to be able to go, wait, this isn't for me. And they end up sort of stuck.
Sorry to interrupt, Jane, but that's where, to me, it would be, well, something's wrong with me. I must be bad. I must be wicked because God said I'm supposed to be doing this, because God said I'm supposed to be happy, because God said that I'm supposed to do whatever my husband wants. And so something must be wrong with me. And that's how I felt so much of my life. And not necessarily always about sex, but it could be about anything. If I have any feelings that are telling me something's wrong, that I believe now are wrong and were wrong, then I saw that as being a defective person, an evil person of not doing what God wanted. Sorry, go ahead. So, yeah, you're right on.
And that kind of reminds me a lot of a conversation that I had with a memoir author named Erica Bornman, who talked about her experiences in the South African religious movement Kwazi-Ubuntu, where she was told by her mother, never to touch herself downstairs, never to explore her body because, that would make her unclean. And didn't even explain that it was because women weren't allowed to have pleasure. So she didn't realize that even if she did touch herself, she would experience that. She didn't know why she wasn't allowed to. She just knew she wasn't. And so, of course, during sex, and if there's no sex and relationship education, and women aren't taught to, and even men aren't taught to understand their bodies and their anatomy, and that actually there is a place where women can enjoy their bodies and enjoy sex and feel comfortable during those interactions. If there's no education around that, then no, how would anybody ever find that out? It must be such a whirlwind coming out of this environment and realizing that you can be in sexual relationships with people where both parties or all parties involved are experiencing some level of pleasure. Do you feel like that's part of your work as well, Kristen, to have those conversations with people about sex and relationships?
Absolutely. When you defined me and my life and my mom, that's what it was. You don't touch, she called it down there, and you don't do this and you don't do that. And premarital sex is as bad as murder, and on and on. And then all of a sudden I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is nice. Then something must be wrong with me. I didn't know. I mean, I had this precious husband at the time who was just amazingly patient with me, with my upbringing, and making sex to be this horrible thing. And I must be wicked all the time. It was just horrible. And so, but I've had many conversations, and I get emotional with many of the girls who've left who thought, they were raped on their wedding nights. And like you said, there's no sex education hardly at all. A lot of sexual abuse, child abuse, sexual abuse. And so there's the trauma that comes from that. And then they feel raped on their wedding because the guys don't even know that the woman's supposed to have any pleasure. And she doesn't even know that. And it just goes on and on. I have been so grateful to have been able to have these conversations with girls who now go, oh, this and oh, that. And you mean really? And that's okay? and it is just amazing. Anyway, yeah.
Jane, how do you tackle these environments where there may be underage marriages taking place? I mean, these communities are so shut off from everything. I mean, is it just through survivor testimonies that this work is able to happen? How is it that some of these coerced polygamous arrangements can be uncovered by law or by organizations that can help the victims involved?
I think that most of it is because in all of these little pockets, because obviously polygamy is like a massive term, there's like little pockets in Utah where there's different sects like the Kingston clan, FLDS, AUB, and so on and so forth. And you've kind of got pockets of survivors coming out of them speaking the truth. And you're like, okay, you're all saying the same thing. This is clearly all polygamy and stuff. But this is where once it gets interesting in that respect, but you've got to look at it from a child abuse point of view and go, well, that's child abuse, that's rape, that's this, that's the other. But then they turn around and go, it's our constitutional right that we have freedom of religion. And that's where I get angry and go, yes, you have the freedom to choose a religion. You're not forced a religion. You can choose to leave. These people are choosing to leave. And just because you're citing freedom of religion does not mean you're above the law when you're then abusing children, raping women, sort of abandoning boys because you don't want the boys, you only want the girls. Like, this is where it breaks down, and this is where it gets really muddled in terms of when can a court of law step in. But we have got case law, which I can go over if you like, that has interfered in this concept of freedom of religion within the US over time, dating way back from the 1800s. It can be done, and it should be done when it's a case of child abuse, rape, and all the other abuse that goes with it. If it was consensual, like the polyamorous relationships, crack on, fine, enjoy your life. I've got no issue with that. You can have 100 if you want, I don't care. But you're not abusing each other, you're not. But these people are being forced, they're being kept against their will. The kids have been indoctrinated, and that's where we need to draw a line, and that's where courts need to come in. And citing like your First Amendment rights and stuff just does not sit well with me anymore. I mean, there's the 14th Amendment, which came in that kind of, I wouldn't say it superseded, but it kind of gave more equality and a bit more, sort of opened it up a bit to find the gaps to kind of tackle this. But again, cults are extremely affluent. They front so many businesses. There's like, we can provide a whole list of Utah businesses, and they've got the hands in all everyone's sort of pockets, law enforcement, politicians and everything, that people won't, a judge won't hear of it because they're worried about their own family.
Absolutely.
And that is a crime. Like,
yeah, so that was going to kind of be my next question. If it's such a prevalent issue in that part of America and probably in other parts of the world as well, in terms of, I suppose, Christian polygamy, because there are a lot of cultures that I know will have their own traditions, their own rituals and rites and practices that we probably don't understand from a Christian perspective. So I'm really just talking about Christian-based religious movements in America. I mean, if it's such a prevalent issue, then there are bound to be senators, members of government that are or judges, as you said, police officers, people in positions of power that are perhaps either influenced or involved in some of these religious movements. And so where is the chance for real legislative change in that sense? Because it makes me feel, having these conversations sometimes like a really small fish in a massive ocean, trying to have these conversations where we can educate one another and kind of get the word out to people about coercion and exploitation and abuse. How do you stop yourselves from feeling that way and knowing that you're going to make a change with this when you have all these obstacles?
The biggest obstacle we have in Utah is basically, so the whole of Utah is LDS. That's fine. We're not attacking them. They can do what they like. However, a lot of cult leaders kind of make this assumption that if we're going after fundamentalists, sooner or later we're going to go after the LDS. Nobody is thinking that. The LDS, for all intents and purposes, do not have polygamy in their life, but they worry about it. Now, all the politicians are sort of mingled in it because they're LDS leaning, which is fine, but that then it's a problem when we're trying to report crime, because if you have a crime that's committed in Utah, you need to report it in Utah, because that's how it works. It's the same in England. You have to report to your police in England it would be county. You have to keep it within that. So crimes committed in Utah, you have to report it to Utah. Even if it's a Utah FBI office, it has to go to Utah. So then you've got the problems with, but they're all LDS and they're worried about this. So it all gets sort of covered up. And again, we're back to power with money in terms of these fundamentalists have all this money in the world, not that they share it with all the people who are sort of living in poverty throughout the polygamous sort of lives. And it just becomes this sort of cycle. It's just continuous. But then this is how they got Warren Jeffs. I'm not sure whether you're aware of him, but he went on the run and he was picked up in an out of state. And that's pretty much one of the only real reasons they managed to nail him is because of the out of state thing. Well, we can't drive everybody out of state. We could try, but it's not going to happen. We have some that sit on the borders between Utah and Arizona, and they'll border hop to avoid being caught. And this is the thing. They clearly know they're doing wrong if they know they have to hide from the law. If they genuinely think they're doing right, they wouldn't have to hide. They wouldn't have to go on the run. They wouldn't have to border hop. But here we are. Here we see this sort of issue. It's similar with the Danny Masterson case of the Scientology. They then took it to California and they've managed to, it's taken forever and a lot of issues have gone with it, but they're finally starting to plow on, and I'm hoping it's going to set some sort of precedent in the religion realm to kind of go, hey, just because you're religious and you have the right to be religious does not mean you can abuse people. Mm-hmm. And we're watching that closely to see if we can get any sort of precedent from that. But as I said to you earlier, we do have case law that has sort of influenced how judges react, and that's decided both for the religion and against the religion in these cases. So we have seen some things sort of coming through, and it's like, so why can't you do it now? But then you're back to money, influence, power, mm-hmm. and they bury people in legal fees. Scientology in particular really does bury people in legal fees. And these people who are survivors of cult, as Kristen mentioned, have nothing. And there's only so many NGOs who can support them because they haven't got an infinite amount of money either. So it's all money related, really.
And the tough part for us has been in Utah is exactly what Jane said. It's the fundamentalists consider themselves Mormons or LDS people. They consider themselves more LDS than the general LDS church. And their doctrine comes right from the LDS church, the original LDS church. And the LDS church may not like polygamy and they may not condone it right now, but they have not ever really done anything about it because it's this freedom of religion thing. And they have people who are infiltrated everywhere. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of fundamentalists, and they're in policing, they're in legal parts. We have lawyers who are corrupt who will do whatever they want for their cult, for their groups, and they're everywhere, and you don't even know who to trust. There was one case where they were going to arrest a man for it was incest, and they're at the right there ready to arrest him, and they get a call to back off. And we know dang well there's been payoffs after payoff, and we have to protect polygamy at any cost. This is the whole bottom line. I would say this is number one. And I grew up with this. Protect polygamy at any cost, no matter what that looks like, no matter who you have to lie to, no matter what you have to do, you have to make it look really good because this is our religion. So
I feel like that's another sort of earmark or commonality of some of these bigger cult-like groups that come through that we might discuss on the show, that people have probably seen documentaries about. Armstrong Ricchio's mission at one point was to really infiltrate themselves into higher levels of authority. And we saw it in Wild Wild Country. It's been documented with Rajneesh, what was happening there in trying to get members of the group into those positions of influence and power. NXIVM and Scientology, again, are just groups that have these sort of notable members. And as soon as somebody walks through the doors of these groups of doctors, lawyers, anybody that might be seen as a prominent figure, treated significantly differently in terms of the love bombing aspect than some other people that may be recruited or converted into that particular group or movement. And of course that speaks for itself in terms of stopping an arrest as it's about to happen, as Absolutely. It's about to take place, which is just absolutely tragic that somebody would have the influence to be able to stop that harm from continuing. And actually the mention of incest was going to be a question that I asked you, Kristen, around how you stop that from happening inside these religious groups where they're so insular. Utah's only so big, and of course fundamentalism isn't only restricted to Utah. It spills out of there into the surrounding areas and probably in different parts of the world, like we've seen with communes and the Children of God, who of course always had their flea bags ready, never were allowed to keep their own passports, never were allowed to have any of their own money, very much human trafficking. So, when you talk about trying to give back those things to individuals that in these groups don't have access to, their passports, legal documents and money and all of that stuff, how do you stop incest from happening? Or is it just something that these polygamous groups kind of just say, well, we know it's going to happen and we encourage it as long as the population of our polygamous group continues to grow?
This is another area that I will be speaking, and Jane is, we're going to speak, address these issues in the national, what is it, Jane? All of a sudden my brain went blank on that.
Yeah, I see it now.
Yeah, thank you. And it was basically not brought up a whole lot in the court case in Canada when they found polygamy would remain forever illegal because of the harms, and it outweighed the religious because the harms were so much greater. And one of these things that has been haunting to me is the intermarriages, the incest. So originally, and I'm going to try to make this really fast, but originally when the LDS Church did the manifesto where they said they would no longer live polygamy, and they were required to do away with it for statehood. A lot of people already know that history. But there was a whole bunch of fundamentalists who continued to live polygamy, and they gathered, and some of the LDS Church leaders at the time supported that. In fact, my grandfather married my grandmother, who was his third wife, in Mexico, and one of the church leaders married them and sanctioned that marriage after the manifesto. And that's part of why this continues and why it went on and on and on. But originally they were a whole bunch of people that gathered, and then they split, and then they split, and then they split. And there's several groups now over all the years that have split and done their own things. Well, the group I was raised in didn't believe in marrying relatives or cousins or any closer than second cousins. It had to be third or further out. For the longest time they did it. The others, the independent polygamists, the other major group, which was the FLDS group. So the one I was raised in and the FLDS are the two largest massive groups in the West. And the FLDS didn't really believe in intermarrying, but they did. They just didn't have enough people. I mean, there were only a certain amount of families, like you mentioned, Casey. There's only a certain few people with being so insular. So they would marry and they'd marry and they'd marry. And they have what's called L-fumarus. I'm not saying it right. I think it's fumarus disease. And that's massive. You can read about that. And then the independents have intermarried forever. And there's fewer of them. And they just go around and around and around and around and intermarrying. And their children have got a disease. And I can't remember the name of that one right this minute. But then before my dad died, when he was still the prophet, apparently I didn't attend church at the time. And he had stood up in church and said that we don't have enough worthy good men, so now we're going to have to start marrying our relatives. And this has probably been, I'm going to say 25, 30 years ago. Now we're second generation. And now they've got what's called Gans disease for the children who are coming up with all kinds of disabilities. And so it's just heartrending and it's horrible. There's not hardly a day go by that I don't hear about the sexual abuse and verbal abuse and physical abuse and spiritual abuse going on consistently. And we feel, Casey, like there's not a lot that can be done. We don't know really how to make a difference, to stop it, this is my daily, quest, is to figure out a way to help end this horrible abuse and cycles. And it's a vicious cycle, goes on. It was bad. I was molested. My sisters were molested, some of my brothers, and it's just gotten worse and worse and worse, not better. And so, yeah, it's a major need for something to change and to become different somehow, some way.
I struggle to understand how the children can be safeguarded against grooming and sexual abuse in environments where it is encouraged for so many children to be born, where it's encouraged for big families. And actually it's quite prevalent to have this discussion, I suppose, today, because yesterday Josh Duggar was actually sentenced to 12 and a half years in prison, I believe, which wasn't the maximum sentence that I know a lot of people were hoping for. But it comes back again to, as you mentioned, the TLC reality show, comes back again to those kind of quiverful families of many, many, many children. And I often wonder how in environments where there is no sex and relationship education, but on the same kind of side of that, there is so much sex taking place for the purposes of procreation. I don't understand how you can safeguard children against sexual abuse and sexual harm in those environments where it's kind of like cognitive dissonance, like the two ideas trying to fight with one another, because you've got we're not allowed to talk about sex and relationships and understand our bodies and anatomy and actually how a woman gets pregnant, but she should continuously be pregnant and providing children for the religious cause. It really kind of it's a difficult thing for me to understand how religious groups position themselves in that way, and how they're is it not inevitable that children may be experiencing this type of harm?
But I also think that even though there's lack of education, as an adult you kind of know things are wrong, and some of these adults, like the men, go out in the real world to work and then come back, so they do have outer experiences in terms of this is wrong. And again, they know things are wrong because they're hiding it. But I also don't think they want to safeguard the children because they want them to marry them off young. Not for nothing, if a family gets rid of a child and marries off someone else, it's no longer their financial burden to provide for that child. But I think it's just so complicated, I think is the word. And this is what we're trying to do by working together, in that Kristen's got that first-hand experience and I've got kind of the facts. I'm sort of got a legal head to kind of look at it and pull it apart,
mm-hmm.
or feed into each other. But the thing I always live by is freedom of religion is a right. It's not an alibi. You have the freedom to choose. You can't then use that as your alibi in court to go, oh, but I have the freedom of religion. My religion that I've made up 30 seconds ago says I can go and rape everyone and it's dog. No, that's not how it works. There has to be a cut-off point, and we do have a cut-off point, but again, you're back to power and money. And in Utah, it's sadly just infiltrated with all of that from all law enforcement and through it. And it's hard, but I don't think we'll see an end to it in our lifetime, but I think as long as we keep making dents and other people afterwards keep making those dents and keep the fight alive. Even if we just save one person a year, that's still one person saved, and it's kind of, you really have to look at little wins as a big win. You can't, you just,
it'd be too overwhelming to consider the entire goal.
Yeah, you can't. You have to take a win as a win, even if it's a small one. You've got to, otherwise you're just gonna make yourself ill, really.
Yeah. Kristen, did you have something to add to that point?
Yes, and you were saying, that it's hard to understand those things, and yet I think you do understand what it looks like because you've done this for so long now. But in a fundamental, one of the things that people like to say, like Jane just barely said, it's to pass the buck to somebody else, and it's not our fault. And I hear families say, well, there's abuse everywhere. There's abuse in monogamous families, and there's sexual abuse everywhere. And so this and that doesn't mean, that doesn't mean we're any worse than anybody else, and that polygamy, it's not polygamy because this is everywhere. I can't tell you how many times I hear that said constantly. Well, if you were to get Tanya Toole's status from HOH or any of the others' stats, it is much higher in polygamy. And we know that people don't report the abuse, and especially in polygamy, like I said, because they need to make polygamy look wonderful and good because it's their religion. They need to cover it up as much as they possibly can. I was raised with that. Make polygamy look good. Don't tell anybody because that will make polygamy look bad. And so the bad person gets the blame, but they never get charged. Like Jane, again, it's my father, my brother, my sister, my uncle. And what happens is even me, I can use my own family. I was a stay-home wife watching 11 children. My sister wife and I had 6 kids in a row. I had a boy, she had a boy. 1 year I had a boy, next year she had a boy, next year I had a boy, next year I had a girl, next year she had a girl, next year I had a girl, another girl. And I was a stay-home mom, and it was insane. Daycare ratios would not ever allow this to happen. It was crazy making. And then I had a middle-aged boy, 4 years older, and then 2 teenage boys. And I thought I was going to go bonkers trying to watch those kids do homework, change diapers, make bottles, babies falling down the stairs, another baby crying in the crib, another baby needs to be fed, the 4-year-old's running down the street, and I'm supposed to be doing dishes and laundry and canning food and fruit, and so meanwhile my teenage boys are doing their investigative things, and they're all checking out what's normal, natural, and they're like, oh, what about this and what about that? And nobody's talked to them about sex. Thank goodness we did some, because we did figure it out that was going to be necessary. And my husband and I were never taught anything. Like I said, my experience has helped us to realize what we needed to do. But in a nutshell, our family was little. 11 kids was little compared to the ones where aunts and uncles and brothers and sisters and stepmoms and stepbrothers and are all around, and they're all watching the kids. The kids are raising the kids. My kids even say that. My older boys say, Mom, we had to babysit so much. And I was like, well, yeah, I have to run to the store. Mom, it seemed like that's all we did is watch the kids.
Yep.
And this is an example of why it's so prolific, if that's the right word, in fundamentalist families. And then they learn the behavior, and then they act out on the behavior, and they learn it, and it just goes on to a vicious cycle.
I was just going to say, just because the abuse happens in outside families, outside of polygamy, doesn't make it right. And outside are committing crimes against children are held accountable by the law. The children are removed. The parents are put in jail. There's all of these provisions to support and safeguard children. Yes, it's happening on the outside, sadly. It happens all too often. But there's a lot more comeuppance for it. People are held.
Yeah.
And just because it is happening on the outside doesn't mean it's right for the polygamous cults. And this is sort of going back to sort of like the Sister Wives show, me and Kristen really discourage anyone watching it because it kind of glamorizes this whole polygamy lifestyle that they want people to see. And we really try and discourage people from watching it because we don't really want, because by watching it, you're funding it.
Mm-hmm.
And you're mostly funding a line of abuse.
Yeah. But the truth is coming out, and I love that. I mean, I remember saying that. I was on the show years ago, and I wish I could do a whole series on just that. But I feel like the family owes me huge apologies for the way they treated me and for my stand when they're all realizing, and especially my cousin niece, Kristyn, who is where I was at the same age. I just cried happy tears when she announced she was leaving, and the truth is coming out, and I'm so grateful for that. All along, I kept saying, "Oh, you should just be watching the cameras. If they ran 24/7, it wouldn't look like this." You know.
Mm. It's interesting as well, just to think about how it's discouraged in a lot of religious community groups. That have fundamentalist values, with or without polygamy, in this sense, that they stay away from like reality TV and influences of the secular world, and yet there's these shows that kind of do glamorize it. And I spoke to Heather Grace Heath, who grew up in Bill Gothard's Advanced Training Institute, kind of fundamentalist, really neglectful homeschooling education, that she is kind of now really an activist on trying to change laws around homeschooling in America, and just making sure that cycle ends, and she was saying that in the Advanced Training Institute sessions that would take place, the Duggars and those families were seen as and treated as royalty inside the fundamentalist realms, as well as, seen as icons of reality TV at the same time. So people must have been watching this show to know, who they were and the influences that they had, but they were seen as like, the golden standard of how many kids you should have, what a fundamentalist wife should look like, and how she should act, and how she should submit to her man as the authority of her life, as the authority umbrella in her life.
If you look at like the UDHR, so the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that's where the human rights came from. It came from World War II, and that was all developed to try and protect people. You have stuff like everyone has the right to life. Everyone should have the right to choose what type of life they have. They have the right to privacy. They have all of these rights, and they're all taken from them in these cults, because you are having to follow instructions from somebody else. Your rights aren't there if you're not being given them by these leaders, and you're not able to take them for yourself. So all of it is totally gone. And this is another reason why the state, as in the whole of the US as a state, under international law, should be sort of interfering to ensure that these people are afforded their rights, because technically they could be held accountable from an international law point of view, because they aren't upholding the covenants that they have signed and ratified. And that's probably a whole other podcast to go into that, but trying to sort of summarize it, the leaders of the country are failing its own citizens by not abiding by these laws, or not making sure that law enforcement are allowing people to live harmoniously with all of their rights. And I think we've just got, and this is why we're trying to break it down into less of a sociological point of view of going, this is wrong, but more in a concrete legal thing, this is wrong. Because we have all the psychologists, which is fantastic, and they're continuously working on trauma. And we couldn't do it without them, because a lot of survivors need some form of therapy to at least string the sentence together to try and tell us these horrors. But we really need to look at it from a different angle and really try and crack down. We were discussing only earlier today, like, even if we were to take one particular abuse, because you find there's common trends, and at least you can tackle one, whether it's like child sexual abuse, it's a very small portion of what's massive, but at least you're making headway, and you're going in, it's dense, and again, we're back to taking a little win when we've got a little win. And I think that's where we need to be, really.
Yeah. I think that's a really great way to look at it in terms of not feeling overwhelmed by the project and the goals that you're trying to achieve, is to kind of just take the small wins where you get them and allow that to keep you motivated to carry on, to get more small wins, which will eventually add to some bigger wins. And you mentioned briefly before the kind of church versus state and First Amendment clauses that exist. And I kind of had this definition that I was looking at on the internet earlier that said the Establishment Clause separates church from state, but not religion from politics or public life. Individual citizens, as you mentioned earlier, are free to bring their religious convictions into the public arena, but the government is prohibited from favouring one religious view over another, or even favouring religion over non-religion. So I kind of feel like the second half of that paragraph is what Utah is doing. Definitely seems to be favouring religion over non-religion, or one religion over another religion. But of course, as well, there's a lot of legislation and talks around things going on in Texas, which it feels like could turn that into a Christian state. There's a lot going on in America with political shifts and Christian nationalism. Do you keep an eye on what is going on in terms of politics and religion in other parts of the country, and does it overlap?
I personally do, because I read the news constantly. I can't help but read the news. To go back, just to rewind a bit, with regards to the Constitution, yes, we have the Establishment Clause, we have the Free Exercise Clause, and the Free Exercise Clause reserves the rights of any American citizen to accept a religious belief and engage in religious rituals. You can choose whether to or whether not to. But the funny thing is, the creation of America really came out of not wanting to be religious in Europe, and then here we are, 2022. And I think what we're seeing now is the fallout of the Trump era. And I wouldn't say Trump is religious. He just says what he needed to say to win, and he's wound all these people up, and it's now finally filtering through. We have the Roe versus Wade debate, which really does feed into religion in terms of, he appointed Amy Coney Barrett, who was a severe conservative, who is in fact a part of a Catholic cult called People of Praise. So she's now on the justice bench, and all of a sudden she's like, oh, I'm not going to let that interfere, but here's Roe versus Wade, and I'm going to use my power. So you have infiltration there coming in. And what we're seeing in Texas, obviously, sadly, with yesterday in the school shooting, is this whole, it's my right, blah, 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 to right to bear arms, my Second Amendment. Okay, so I've seen on Twitter people going, guns don't kill people, people kill people. Okay, but that person picked up that gun, put the bullets in that gun, and then shot those people. Guns are killing people. And they're trying to make it, they're saying it's not political. Ridiculous. They're also saying it's a mental health crisis, not the fact that I have a whole list of how many school shootings have been in the last 50 years, and I screenshot it to put it on a TikTok. It was 35 screenshots to get it on a TikTok. That is too many. And it's just absolutely barbaric. I think we are really seeing the Trump thing play out. I don't think polygamy is trying to sort of take over the world or the country. I think they're just so into their own community. I don't know that I kind of feel like they have blinkers on when they view us. Like they just think if they stay in their little remit that they're going to be okay. I don't know that they're really, Kristen might be able to answer this a bit better, but I don't think they're really that bothered about the outsiders as long as we're not affecting them, because they don't really. Scientology throws it on you, and there's some other cults that kind of throw it on you, like Jehovah's Witnesses knocking on your bloody door. But they're quite, to an extent, they keep themselves to themselves. You don't realise you're paying money into them businesses because they use different fronts, but I don't think they're trying to take over. But I do think we're seeing a very big shift, and it's all coming from the Trump era. It's just happening. The way it's all sort of worked is coming out in Biden's time, but it's not Biden, it is Trump, it's the aftermath. I think we're swaying too far now.
Right, yeah.
What I grew up with was major anti-government. They're coming after us. They're evil. They're bad. They're awful. But it's okay to use them, and we can take food stamps and welfare and money, and it benefits us. And if we can get any, anything at all that we can take or get or have, and especially the other fundamentalist groups I told you, they were even more, we were kind of discouraged to do that much, but the others were encouraged to do that. Overall, in what you're saying, I feel like that the fundamentalists believe that way back in the original teachings and doctrine that the LDS church and the fundamentalists and the Mormons, and that polygamy would come back and they would run the world at some point before Jesus returns and or during that time. And not that they're out warring and planning, but I believe with all my heart, from what I keep hearing all around me, is that they definitely feel like that they have every right and every power and every authority and all the priesthood, and they are the ones who are more high and mighty and deserve all these God-given, that God wants them to have it all and to do it all and to run the country. And so there's definitely that support in this, in all these movements, guns and whatever that other, well, we know what we're talking about. I try not to do too much political on that, but they definitely are very conservative, extremely conservative.
And it was mentioned briefly earlier on in the episode that there is a mentality almost around boys within these polygamous groups sometimes that are pushed to the wayside or seen as less valuable, perhaps than a woman who can, or a girl who can grow into a woman who can then provide children for the polygamous groups. I think that you mentioned in some of your writing to me, Jane, that the term was lost boys. And I just wondered if, before we kind of discuss where people can find the Sound Choices Coalition, all of the places that you are doing your work, if we kind of just talked about this last segment before finishing up our episode today.
When I was doing my research, the lost boys, I didn't manage to touch on this too much because obviously it was a limited dissertation. And Kristen might be able to sort of shed a bit more light on this, but there's this sort of phenomenon about, I don't know which particular groups they are, but boys, if you need the right ratio, because obviously you want plural wives. And there was this sort of understanding that some boys would be literally dropped off in the side of the road and just left to fend for themselves. Sadly, I didn't get any time to do much research for my actual dissertation on this. But there is that sort of, you can't choose the gender of your child. So what happens when you have too many boys, because you need more wives than you do men if you're going by their teachings.
Yeah, exactly. Even so, in the AUB, the group I was raised in, I don't remember that the boys were ever kicked out or ever told to leave, but there definitely weren't enough women for the men, because if one man takes two wives, that leaves that to another, the guy's out, and three wives, it leaves 2/3 out, and the math, that how that goes. And the older men all want the younger wives because they can produce all these children, and the younger they are, the more valuable they are, because then they can be trained and taught and coerced into being the kind of wife that the men want to have, et cetera, et cetera. That's another big time doctrine. But what happens is that the boys in the group I was raised in, they didn't get kicked out, but my brothers, all of my brothers, because we were all related, and way back then was before we were supposed to marry relatives, they would convert women from school or high school or wherever at work, and they would convert them all and get them to be the wife. And then as time went on, the plural, because they weren't raised in it, didn't have that testimony that they had like we did, then they've all left. All but one of my brothers. Dad had 23 biological kids. And 13 of my brother's wives, first wives, all left that were stayed and lived it. And so it was like my dad said, the times come when there's just not enough girls. There's not enough men. There's just not enough. We have to start marrying our relatives. And still there's a shortage of girls because, like Jane said, there's just as many boys. And what happened is in the FLDS group over the years, they were kicking boys out. They were finding any way possible that they could get rid of them because they weren't going to get wives. They needed to get rid of all these boys so that the older men that were there could have all the young girls. So this is definitely an issue and a big problem as well, and has been for one young man wrote about how he fell in love with this girl and they were engaged, and then her dad talked her into marrying an older man that was a friend of his, and so he had to leave. There was no other wives for him. He had to go.
And is this something that the coalition is focusing on, support for other genders coming out of their respective religious groups?
We definitely try to help the men too. We've been involved with a lot of these lost boys over the years, and other have done that. I remember that was one of my very first passion jobs, was walking with some of these boys that had been kicked out. And there were at one time, I don't remember exact number, but it was over 200 boys that were banned all at once and driven to the roadside, not to come home. They were all evil. They were told they were bad and evil. And that's even another story about what happens to these boys. But I remember walking with two of them into a campus, and then they said, well, we can't even read. There's no way we're going to go to college. So we had to start back at the elementary level and sign them up to, and that's, like I said, that's a whole other story. That's a book we could write about those boys and where their lives have been and what happened to them. They can look up a lot of that online and on the internet. So look up Willie Steed. He's precious, and his story's there. He's one of the lost boys.
We've been doing on our socials on a Wednesday, kind of like taking the Humans of New York stories and making them like Humans of Cults, I suppose. And he actually did a story for us. It's a really nice story, and we did pictures with him as well. I don't want to ruin the story, but it has a happy ending. That's all I can say. And the pictures are amazing. The end pictures, not the earlier ones.
Yeah.
Jane, you mentioned earlier on that there were some changes in legislation in Utah. What were those changes, and how has it impacted the work that you're trying to do?
So, to simplify it totally, polygamy was illegal, and that's how it was. And they've changed it, so they've changed the, how do you put it? It's technically not illegal now. So they have the Bigamy Amendments of 2020, and instead of sort of being properly punished for committing polygamy, they've made it to a similar of getting like a parking ticket. So it's a really minuscule offence, and it's really, your face is doing what I was doing when I was like, but it's, I won't say it's interesting, but I asked Kristen, like, why are people, because there was a story came out that some women supported this. So I asked Kristen, but why would people, and they said because they've put like an amendment in it that Kristen could probably explain this a bit better. But it's almost to protect women, sort of say you can come forward and you're not going to get into trouble because you're the victim. So it was kind of turning it on its head and making it victim-led, but that hasn't really sort of been realised in reality. So it's still more detrimental because they haven't really publicised that element of it. So people are still like, oh, no, we can't because we're going to get jailed, or we're going to get this. And they're probably told in the course, you can't leave because you will be put in jail for the rest of your life and you will go to hell. And, you know, I can imagine all of that. So yeah, that happened in February 2020, which was just before I started doing my long study of that. So it's been an interesting sort of turn of events, and we're trying to sort of grasp the new legislation and how we can still help people within the, and I think we do need to do a bit of advocacy work in terms of what does this actually mean, and maybe if we do get out there a bit more and be like, no, you're a victim. If a victim comes forward, you are not going to be penalized for this. But again, when you're dealing with someone who's been told, you know, black is white all their life, they're not going to believe a stranger. So it's a slow burning process, I think, to kind of really make people understand. But not for nothing, in the real world, when people are victims, especially something like rape, when we hear about a lot of this in the news, oh, but was it rape or was it lack of consent? Did I say no? Did I do this? And people doubt themselves. And it's the same. It applies the same to survivors of cults. They're doubting themselves because they've been told other things all of this time. Their perpetrator has got in their head, I didn't rape you. You never said no, so I assumed it was okay. But the argument to that is, but I never said yes. And it kind of all, you know, but we have the understanding as an outsider to kind of understand how to make that work for us.
Yeah. Kristen, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that.
Yes, thank you. So what I perceive is the biggest issue with that is, Jane was absolutely right, is that their biggest, they meaning legislators and those who all voted for it, no matter what we said, no matter what victims said, no matter what, they had already decided, the majority, which is LDS, decided they would decriminalize, not decriminalize, but make it, like Jane said, just a slap on the hand. And what their goal was is so that people would feel free to come forward and talk about the harms or the crimes or abuses or so forth. But what we kept saying to them over and over, and what is still in effect, and at least from all of the things I'm hearing in stories, is that nobody is coming forward, not enough, about the abuses. We talked about that already during this whole time. And the reason they don't is because they're leaders and they believe they are not supposed to do it. It's not so much the fear. Even me, I wasn't so afraid of the government coming after us or you know, doing that, as I was my perpetrators and my dad and the prophet and God. They terrified me way more than the outside did. And this is what these people who are born and raised in believers, is that we must protect polygamy at any cost. And that means don't report it, don't tell anybody. And that's where the leaders use their power to influence them, is that it's not so much even the fear of government now, because they say they won't. It's that if you do this, then you're going against God, then you're going against your mother, you're going against the prophet and the father and blah, blah, blah. So that the coercion is inside, and it's so powerful that it's hard to ever get away from that. And people most of us who left figured we were going to hell for leaving when we left. Most people, that's what I hear. And thank goodness a lot of us don't feel that way anymore. But that was the fear, is you're moving out into hell.
And I imagine that this is a lot of the conversation and themes with survivors and individuals that you're working with on a daily basis, having these conversations and going through this deconstruction.
It is. It's really a big process, and it's and we need so much more help, and any people to love on and parent and take people in. And because there's, especially my concern is even the younger ones who've been so isolated into Warren's area. You know, it's bad everywhere, but that was even worse because they've been taken away from their parents, and they don't even, most of them, a lot of them don't even know who their parents are, especially the younger ones. Moved. And again, that's another whole story. But yeah, it's really a dilemma on where and why and what and how to do with the late changes. One thing I'll say real quick is that part of the reason the biggest reason we didn't want it to be decriminalized is because, like Canada, they found the harms of polygamy. They found that they would, and anybody who does that and researches and read Craig Jones' book, A Cruel Arithmetic, which talks about these boys. It's called A Cruel Arithmetic by Craig Jones. And he discusses these lost boys and how that looks and all of the harms. And Chief Justice Bowman said, polygamy will forever remain, I think I might be quoting him wrong, but it will remain illegal because of the harms of polygamy. And that's what we were trying to say to Utah legislators is it's bigger than just a religious freedom here. This is huge in itself. It's harmful. It takes away these human rights from women and children and education and on and on. And so one example really quick is we were working with a young girl who was trying to get custody of her children who were being raised to be polygamous kids, and their dad was telling them their mother was wicked for leaving and turning them against their mom and on and on. And the judge happened to be, compassionate about their situation, and he said polygamy is illegal. Therefore, these mother will leave, have the right to leave, does have a right to get housing and so forth, and have custody of the kids. Yes, he can have visiting, but she will have the main custody of the kids. And he did that based on polygamy being illegal. And now there's no way you can even bring that up. They won't let you talk about it. In fact, even before this was decided, it was decided, but publicly decided they wouldn't let people talk about polygamy being what it is and the harms of polygamy. It's been this way and you just don't discuss it. So yeah, it's a big, huge dilemma here.
And you said that you need as much help as possible. So does that mean that there is the opportunity for individuals to come and volunteer for the coalition and help in some way?
Yeah, so we're working on trying to sort of divide and conquer, I suppose, would be the way. So at the minute, we've recruited some people who are most likely going to take over our socials, maybe develop YouTube, TikTok, some more video-oriented stuff, because that would leave Kristen and I in particular to have more free time to work on the sort of bigger things like the legal stuff and sort of, I suppose, piloting programs and devising new policies and procedures to better help survivors, and how we can really, I suppose, make the transition to the real world smooth, make sure they get everything that's afforded to them. Mm-hmm. If we can signpost them somewhere to obtain legal aid, we will do that too. But I mean, we can't really do it without our volunteers. So we are recruiting volunteers at the minute. If anyone's listening and wants to help us out, you can hit us up on our socials. So we can, like I say, divide and conquer is probably the best way to explain what we're trying to do, and to develop new programs.
Okay. What we'd really like to do is, like Jane said, is work with the legal systems to help more victims and to see what that need is. And the girls and boys who have bought custody. I know a girl who's still in court after all these years, who's having a hell of a time getting custody of her children. And the father's, her daughter's about marriageable age, 12, in one of the groups. And she's terrified of, all these things. And so for Jane and I and the other board members, we'd like to see absolutely more done on this legal part and helping these women and men have, so anybody who's willing to donate, we can help with legal issues there and with the lawyers. And I mean, these girls are just not just one, many are in dire poverty and trying to make it on their own. The women leave, the men have the houses, they stay home, they all gather up together. They get all their funding together. They go against the woman and make her look evil. They turn the children against the woman. And it's happened for men too, but of course it's mostly when the women leave. And they will stop at nothing to make someone look like they're evil and throw them under the bus. And so then the judges don't know the real stories. They buy the stories. And the women end up in homeless shelters sometimes, and without their children. The horror stories could go on. And you can read some of these. You can find them, and we're posting more of these and so forth. Yeah.
So for anybody that is interested in volunteering or finding out more about the coalition or reading some of these testimonies and reports, where can people find you on social media? What is the name of your website and any other places that people might find information about the Sound Choices Coalition?
I mean, if you Google us, obviously our website will come up. Although it's down at the minute because we're redoing it all. But our Facebook is active, so it's just Sound Choices Coalition, and we also have an Instagram for those who don't have Facebook, one or the other. We try and do it sort of like, so Monday is like educational posts. So we've covered like what is polygamy. Recently we've done like what is the law, what's human rights law, what should be afforded. Wednesdays has always been like our Humans of New York, but Humans of Cult sort of a thing. We've got loads of different stories on there, men, women, and we have got some non-polygamous cult people who have shared a story. And then Friday we really like share news that's happened. So like the Josh Duggar thing, for example, would be on there, or will be on there rather, just to try and sort of keep it alive. And just to sort of open that sort of communication, we always sort of post a question with it so we can invite people to chat and share their thoughts. You know, we have survivors commenting on there. I'm not sure that you'd know who they were unless you know them, because we don't want to like let out who's who. And it's really sort of striking a chord with people, you know. And through there you can donate to us. We had, it's ended now, but we had a fundraiser for a girl who she's in a legal battle with her husband, or ex-husband rather, to try and get what's rightfully hers. You know, she's not had a penny from him, and the court has ordered him to do X, Y, Z, and he's not even done that. He's literally he told his kids, I make the laws in this house, we do as I say.
Yeah
Like it's
you're above the laws. If you're living God's laws, they're above the laws of the land. That's the belief.
Yeah.
So I'll post all of the links to those various places in the episode description if anybody is interested in reaching out for any of the reasons we've discussed, just more information, donating, whether that's financially or your time in a volunteer position. There's also going to be a panel appearance at the International Cultic Studies Association by Jane and Kristen that will have been out by this point, but all of those panels are going up on YouTube after the event has finished. So if that link is available anywhere publicly by that point, I will also include that in the episode description, or at least a link to the ICSA's website, so you can go and have a look at their archive of panels and discussions as well, because the conference this year just looks insane with the amount of speakers and content that's going to be covered. It's like I said in a previous episode where I interviewed Pat Ryan, who's kind of organizing the whole event, that it's like going to a festival and all your favorite acts are playing at the same time, and you can't be in like 30 places at once. So of course all of this stuff will have to go up on YouTube, and that will be available at some point as well. There is also the book 50 Years in Polygamy by Kristen Decker. So that's your memoir, and that is actually available for people to purchase anywhere right now. Is that right?
You know what? They can get it on Amazon. They can go there and order it, and they can get an ebook from Amazon, and or they could order it right from me, so Amazon doesn't take their cut. And that way we get to I donate our stuff to the coalition, of course. So if they would like a book, they can email me at KristynDubDecker@gmail.com, and I'll spell that real quick. It's KRISTYN. Dub is DUB, Decker, DECKER @gmail. And I'll tell you how you can get a book. $10.
Amazing. And is there anything that either of you would like to add before we end our discussion today?
I mean, there's so much to add in terms of like what's going on.
Yeah.
But I mean, we've kind of tried to do a whistle-stop tour of the issues as best we can, because quite frankly, nobody wants to listen to a year-long podcast as it is. Like, you know, it has to end some point. But I just hope that people really kind of stop watching TLC. If there's one thing that come out of this, stop watching TLC's crappy sister wife shows, and like just use Google and really understand the harms of polygamy, not this glorified thing you see on TV.
The girls are all sweethearts. I'd have to say I love them, but really the story has not been told accurately, and the harms and the sadness and the neglect and on and on. So I'm grateful the truth has finally come out, but I quit watching it a long time because every time I watch it, I know I'm so, and that's sad. I don't think people realize that they're putting money in the hands of Cody Brown, you know, so not the kids, not the wives necessarily, but him. Yeah.
So stop watching TLC.
Yeah.
And know that they're
real. It's not reality. Yeah.
And just know that there is a non-profit in existence that is focusing on polygamous groups and supporting people moving away from those groups with a whole manner of issues that somebody might come up against when they decide to move out of one of these polygamous environments. So that's the Sound Choices Coalition. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Jane, both for your time today. Thank you for all of the work that you are doing around advocating for victims and survivors of these abusive religious groups. And thank you for your activism work around trying to create legal change and legal reform in parts of America to kind of hopefully set an example that can be carried out in places outside of America as well, where I'm sure these issues are still incredibly prevalent and ongoing to this day. So thank you both so much. I hope that your ICSA panel goes really well, and hopefully there will be a bit more traffic directed towards your work from our episode today in our conversation.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks, ladies. I appreciate you both. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye. That is the end of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram @cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast.
If you look around, there are so many ways to make a difference. At Capella University, our FlexPath format gives you a different way to earn your degree. Take courses at your speed. Move on whenever you're ready. Education should fit your life. Learn more at capella.edu.